Imagine standing knee-deep in frozen snow while machine gun fire slices the air inches above your head. Not a battlefield from a movie, but a real hillside in eastern France, where a single mistake means instant death. This was the reality for American infantrymen on the Western Front in January 1945, when the war was supposed to be nearing its end, but instead delivered one of its most brutal moments. At 14:30 on January 8, 1945, U.S. Army Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham lay pressed into the snow at the base of a steep, forested rise known as Hill 616 near the village of Kaysersberg. He was 24 years old, a veteran of 3 campaigns, and at that moment, surrounded by chaos and gunfire, he had no intention of dying there. Above him, German forces had turned the hill into a fortress. 3 MG42 machine guns were dug into reinforced timber positions along the slope, each capable of firing over 1,000 rounds per minute. From their elevated positions, the gunners commanded every approach. The Americans below had walked straight into a killing zone. Company Sergeant of the 3rd Infantry Division had been advancing through the Alsace-Lorraine region when the ambush struck. Machine gun fire poured down from the hilltop, pinning the platoon flat against the snow. Artillery rounds exploded behind them, cutting off retreat. The only direction left was forward, straight uphill into overlapping fields of fire. The snow around the American position was already stained dark. 11 men from 2nd Platoon had been killed earlier that week alone. Every soldier on that slope understood the math. The Germans held the high ground. They had ammunition, they had cover, and they had clear sight lines. In the Vosges Mountains campaign, the 3rd Infantry Division had suffered some of the highest daily casualties of any American unit in Europe. This hill was exactly the kind of place where men disappeared. Dunham looked back toward his platoon. 35 yards behind him, his men lay motionless, faces pressed into the snow, rifles useless against the storm of fire above them. If they stayed where they were, German artillery would soon bracket the position and wipe them out. If they tried to retreat, the machine guns would cut them down in the open. They were trapped. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow was nearly 18 inches deep. Dunham's olive drab uniform made him stand out starkly against the white hillside. Every soldier who had tried to move even a few feet had been spotted instantly and driven back by gunfire. The Germans owned Hill 616. That was when Dunham made a decision no one ordered him to make. He crawled back toward the company position and found a discarded white mattress cover. Without a word, he tore it open and pulled it over his uniform like a robe. Then he began loading himself for an assault that, by all logic, should have been impossible. He stuffed 12 30-round magazines for his M1 carbine into every pocket and strap he could reach. He clipped Mark II fragmentation grenades onto his belt until it sagged under the weight. He hooked more grenades through his suspenders and even forced them into the buttonholes of his jacket. When he stood up, he was carrying over 70 pounds of ammunition and explosives. His platoon sergeant stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Dunham gave none. He dropped to the snow and started crawling uphill. The first 75 yards took 18 minutes. Dunham moved only when the German machine gun fire shifted to another sector. When the MG42 swept back across his route, he flattened himself into the snow and waited. The mattress cover soaked through almost immediately. His hands went numb. The rifle sling cut into his shoulder from the weight dragging him down. By the time he reached the first machine gun position, he was less than 10 yards away. The German emplacement was built from heavy logs, positioned to interlock its fire with the other 2 guns higher up the slope. 3 German soldiers manned it, one firing, one feeding the belt, one scanning the hillside below. They had no idea a single American was crawling toward them through the snow, bleeding already, committed to a decision that would either save his platoon or end his life in seconds. and then Dunham rose to his feet. Imagine being completely surrounded by enemy tanks with no cover, no reinforcements, and no clear escape. This was the situation on the morning of January 22nd, 1945, in the small French town of Holzwehr. The dawn light barely touched the frozen fields as Company 1 of the 3rd Infantry Division prepared for what seemed like an impossible defense. Russell Dunham's back was still raw from the wounds he had sustained at Hill 16, but retreat was not an option. German armored forces were advancing from 3 directions. 7 Panther tanks from the west, their 75mm guns already scanning the open farmland, and 3 Tiger I tanks from the south, the deadly 88mm barrels trained on anything that moved. Between Dunham's platoon and the approaching mechanized assault, there was nothing but frozen ground, empty barns, and the skeletal remains of old farmhouses. Company 1's position consisted of a cluster of farm buildings on the southern edge of Holzwehr. The ground offered no concealment, and anti-tank support was limited to 2 bazooka teams with only 14 rockets. Every soldier knew that one misstep could mean instant death. The Germans were part of the armored reserve from the 19th Army. Units previously held back during Operation Nordwind, now unleashed to cut off the American advance toward the Rhine. The air smelled of frozen earth, gunpowder residue, and the faint tang of fear that clung to every soldier in the company. The company commander quickly ordered white flags to be raised from 3 buildings. German tanks halted their advance as infantry moved forward to process the prisoners. 147 men walked out with their hands raised, rifles confiscated, and eyes wide from the shock of survival. But Dunham had no intention of surrendering. The pain in his back, the deep gash still oozing blood, and the frostbitten feet were nothing compared to the thought of giving up the fight. He slipped quietly out the back of the farmhouse, keeping low, and moved west toward a cluster of outbuildings roughly 200 yards away. Every step sent sharp pain radiating through his spine, but he focused on moving through tree lines and ditches, avoiding open roads where German patrols might spot him. The outbuildings included a small barn, a tool shed, and a stone storage structure with a wooden door hanging loosely on its hinges. Dunham checked the barn first, empty except for rotting hay. The shed offered nothing but broken farm implements. Finally, he approached the stone storage building. Inside were 6 wooden barrels, each 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. Dunham lifted the lid of the first barrel, frozen potatoes. The second barrel was empty. The third, however, was filled to the top with sauerkraut. The smell hit him instantly, sharp, acidic, almost overwhelming. With no time to waste, Dunham forced himself down into the cold, fermented cabbage, pressing his back against the brine-soaked walls. The lid closed over his head, sealing him in darkness and the pungent smell. Outside, German soldiers were moving among the farm buildings, inspecting every structure, lifting lids and shouting in rapid German. For 13 hours, Dunham remained motionless inside the barrel. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit as night fell, and the brine began to freeze around him. His hands and feet lost all feeling. The wound in his back burned with the acidic brine, yet he forced his body to shift subtly every hour to keep blood moving, despite the searing pain. At 7 o'clock on the morning of January 23rd, thin slivers of light penetrated the gaps in the barrel lid. Dunham listened intently. The German patrols had moved on, leaving the farmyard deserted. Slowly, he lifted the lid and climbed out, his uniform frozen stiff and soaked with brine, his fingers white from frostbite. The bandages on his back had dissolved completely, leaving the wound exposed to the cold air. Around him, the farmyard was littered with American helmets and rifles abandoned during the surrender. He needed to move, to return to American lines before German forces returned. But first, He had to relieve himself after 13 hours confined. As he stepped to the side of the barn, 2 German soldiers emerged from the opposite corner, rifles raised. They immediately spotted him, shouting in German. Dunham raised his hands, unarmed, soaked, and covered in cabbage brine. His Colt M1911 was hidden beneath his field jacket, but the Germans saw only a disoriented, harmless soldier. They moved closer to search him. One rifle trained while the other inspected his jacket. The first soldier discovered a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in Dunham's left breast pocket, and the 2 soldiers argued over ownership, completely ignoring the weapon hidden under his right arm. The argument lasted 30 seconds, enough for Dunham to react. He drew his Colt and shot the guard on the right point blank, then fired twice at the guard on the left. Both men collapsed. Without hesitation, Dunham kicked open the Kubelwagen door and sprinted toward the tree line, 300 yards to the north. Behind him, German shouts and gunfire echoed briefly before stopping. The patrol was distracted. They had prisoners and a command post to secure. Dunham, alone in enemy territory with no map, no compass, and only 4 rounds in his pistol, pushed forward. His back wound reopened, pain radiating through his torso with every step. Blood seeped through his uniform again. Frostbite had rendered his feet numb and unsteady. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, yet he kept moving west, toward the sound of American artillery, toward safety. He traveled through tree lines and frozen ditches, avoiding roads and villages, forcing his feet to move despite the burning agony of frostbite. Night fell, and he found shelter in a destroyed barn, crawling into the hayloft for insulation. There was no fire. German patrols were everywhere. The next day, Dunham pressed on. He crossed frozen fields and empty roads, hiding from passing German vehicles. His feet, once numb, now burned painfully. Inspecting them at night, he saw blackened toes, 2nd-degree frostbite, possibly 3rd. He redonned his boots and continued west. On January 25th, the sound of American artillery finally guided him. A steady rumble of 155mm howitzers came from the west. Following the noise, he reached the Isle River by mid-afternoon. A steel bridge crossed the water, with American engineers reinforcing it with timber supports. Approaching, he raised his hands, shouting his name, rank, and unit, and one engineer recognized him. Dunham crossed the bridge, collapsing at the far end. His back was infected, his feet nearly lost to frostbite, and he had lost 20 pounds over 3 days. Medics immediately attended to him, cutting away the brine-soaked uniform, packing the wound with sulfur powder, and administering morphine. For 6 hours, surgeons worked to save his feet and clean the wound, and 3 days later, a lieutenant informed him that the recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross had been approved. Russell Dunham had survived against impossible odds. 3 machine gun nests destroyed, German armor bypassed, enemy patrols evaded, and a body ravaged by gunfire, frostbite, and infection. One man had changed the fate of an entire platoon, proving courage under fire and the relentless will to survive. Hill 16 and Holzwehr became symbols not just of strategy, but of human endurance, daring, and the unyielding fight for life on the Western Front in the final months of the Second World War.